Hello everyone, you're listening to the Eiffel Tower podcast. My name's Oliver G, and today it's all about wine. But before we get into that, this show is brought to you by French Today. French Today, they do audiobooks, they'll help you speak French. Check it out at frenchtoday.com/earful9, and that will give you an additional 10% discount off all of the audiobooks. Check it out. I'll be talking a bit more about them at the end of the episode, as well as reading out a little bit of Gmail. But today, we're talking about wine with Geoffrey Finch from Paris Wine Walks. We're going to talk about everything secret vineyards, how important wine is to the history of Paris. But if you want to check him out, it's Paris Wine Walks, so you can look it up, paris-wine-walks.com. And that information will be in the show notes below. If you're interested in finding some of the addresses that he mentioned, I'd encourage you to become a Patreon supporter, where there will be a beautiful PDF document with everything he's listed right there on patreon.com/The Eiffel Tower. Let's get into it. Here he is, Geoffrey Finch from Paris Wine Walks. Here we go. Okay, Geoffrey Finch, welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
You have a great name.
Thank you.
Geoffrey Finch. It sounds like a character from a famous book.
Geoffrey Slater Finch. Even better, no?
Slater. Wow. Okay. And that's a British accent, right?
Not exactly. I think I'm actually from the west coast of Canada. So
You're from the west coast of Canada?
Yeah, but the last bastion of the British Empire, Victoria, British Columbia, which is... But I grew up as a boy chorister from the age of 6 to 14, singing and learned to enunciate.
Wow. So west coast of Canada, is that where Penelope Fletcher was from as well?
She is, in fact, from Hornby Island, yeah.
And you knew there?
Well, Hornby Island is off... Vancouver Island is a large island, and there are hundreds of little islands that are just off the...
Right. Okay.
Between there and the mainland.
So I was pretty far off geographically, but I think I got the right kind of idea.
No, that was exactly spot on. Hornby is really close to Victoria.
Okay, great. But we're not here to talk about accents or indeed Canada or Britain. We're here to talk about wine, and I think we should start off kind of straight away on the thing that surprised me the most. And I'll just rewind a bit from my perspective. I once said on this show that there is a secret vineyard in Paris and that there's only one. And then I got a sort of angry-ish letter in from someone. "You fool, Oliver," they said. There's two. And they pointed out that you're already laughing. And I have it on good authority now that there's more. What can you tell me about this?
Well, the history of Paris is really wine. And the vineyards that actually exist today, though not necessarily on lands that were originally planted to vineyards, are found in practically every neighborhood of the city. There are, by my count today, there are actually 20 vineyards. Now, 20, 7 of which actually produce wine. So the number of vineyards is sort of, what is a vineyard? A vineyard is a collection of vines, you could say. None of them are actually, consequential in terms of surface area. They don't produce large quantities of grapes, and some of them produce practically no grapes at all. And those that are actually producing grapes for wine produce very small quantities.
Right.
And in fact, you can taste those wines only one day of the year. At least if you're a normal person visiting, you can... October 6th this year is the Fête de la Vigne, the festival of the vine. And it's the only day of the year when you can go around to all the different vineyards and actually have a sample, little tiny taste of the wines that are produced.
Is that your favorite day of the year?
It's one of those days that I really... It's fun because it's an opportunity to see the evolution. Interestingly enough, I would say that some of the wines are... None of them are fabulous. They're not great wines, but they're good.
Right.
And they're interesting because you actually have Paris in your glass.
Yeah.
And where else what else can you say that would... or taste that would bring you into that sort of intimate relationship with Paris?
Well, I once accidentally swallowed some water from the Bassin de la Villette when I was swimming there. Does that count for anything?
Well, water, because it flows, is not really geographically stable.
Sure.
It doesn't stay in one place. So Yeah, the water of the La Villette came from who knows where.
Yeah, true.
And
true.
how old is it? And what? Yeah.
I tell you, it didn't taste good.
No.
But these vineyards, I assume the biggest and the most famous one is the one in Montmartre on the sort of backside of the Sacré-Cœur.
It is indeed, yeah. It was planted in 1934, and it was originally planted. I mean, the story of that vineyard is quite a wild tale in a sense, because the people that it was basically a deserted lot that the city was planning to build a residence, and some artists of the community of Montmartre resisted that idea and said, no, we don't want a horrible HLM. We would prefer to have, a vineyard. And so the municipality said, well, sure, but where are you going to get the vines? And they said, oh, no problem, we have lots of friends. And they did, from, I think, over 27 different sources. So there were 27 different cépages.
What's a cépage?
A grape varietal.
Okay.
So there were 27 different varietals, which meant that coming to maturity was, complicated. There would be some that would mature more earlier than others. So for harvesting, it was super complicated.
Wow.
So it's been replanted in recent years, and it's predominantly now Pinot Noir and Gamay, with still some, there's still vines of the 27.
Mm.
So, yeah, it's the biggest producer. The second, I would say, is the Clos des Morillons, which is in the 15th.
Is that the one in Georges Brassens, the park?
Exactly.
Yes.
Well done.
Well, that's the email I got from a listener, and I went and checked it out, and I thought it was pretty cool.
Yeah, well, then after that, you have
everything
three others that are they're operated by the city, which are the Bercy, Belleville, and Bergère. So those are sort of like the main five. There's a little bit of wine sort of ceremoniously, or I'm not sure, sort of traditionally made by les pompiers, the fire department, on the Rue Blanche, which is in the 9th arrondissement.
Really?
Yeah.
These firefighters have a lot of secrets going on inside their fire station.
Well, that's the only fire station that actually I know of that has vines. And
hang on, just the one on is that the one that's down towards the big boulevard, the one that runs from Republic, so sort of south end of the 9th arrondissement? Is that where you're talking about?
Well, it's on the Rue Blanche, which is running sort of north-south.
Yeah, okay. I know that fire station. I've never been in there though. So what they've got,
but it's not really. It's not. Their vines are actually sort of decorative. You could say
right.
They're very long. Trellising vines and pruning vines is all about minimizing the amount of wood and leaf so you can maximize the fruit.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why we look at vineyards and we see these stumpy little sticks in winter with nothing on them, and then they grow into these flourishing shoots of green and so on. But you're creating basically a wall of green to maximize photosynthesis and minimize the amount of wood and leaf. You're maximizing photosynthesis with the minimum amount of leaf. Because if you let a vine grow, it'll grow very, very long. It'll kind of not endlessly, but the longest vine I know of in Paris is 47 meters in one direction and 17 in the other. On the Rue Crimée in the 19th, there's the Église Saint-Serge. It's the entrance to there. But there's also, the Hôpital Bretonneau in the 18th arrondissement also has a vineyard, and they also make a bit of wine. There's the Jardin des Plantes vineyard, which is sort of it's the only national one. All the others are actually managed by the city. There, the caretakers they've been talking about possibly making wine just for fun, but they generally just eat the grapes or make juice.
Right. But so if we've got one of these vines, or like in the fire station, they got a handful of vines, how many grapes does it take to make a bottle?
Oh, that's a good question. Normally, it's the calculation in most respects is basically one vine. If it's growing specifically to produce wine, one vine, one bottle.
Okay.
So, but when it's growing to length and it's sort of decorated, because these ones, the Rue Blanche, for example, they climb up and then they're trellised along the walls of the building, and so they're probably 10, 15, 20 meters long, and so it's I don't know how much wine they actually produce. Right. It wouldn't be much.
I wouldn't surprise me if they drank it at the fireman's ball at the end of the season or whatever that is.
Yeah.
Do they use the vines to slide down as well to get from the top floor to the bottom?
No.
Oh.
They're pretty they're not very smooth.
No, I can imagine. But so what we haven't talked about is you are absolutely an expert on wine, but this goes back to in France at least to the 80s, early 80s.
Yeah, my first year in France was actually working in a vineyard. So I spent about a year working in a vineyard in the Côte de Castillon, which is near Saint-Emilion. Then I sold wine in England for a while, in Bath, and then came back to France to work on hotel barges and became a barge captain. And then I worked
on the Seine, on the river.
No, that was in Burgundy.
Okay.
In the Auxerrois, the region around Chablis, and also in the Burgundy Canal. Actually, it was all over. I worked in a number of number of different boats.
That's kind of a strange jump from selling wine in Bath to being a barge captain in Burgundy.
Yeah, I had a lot of sailing experience.
Right.
I sailed across the Atlantic years before.
Really?
And so I was actually really keen to. The barging is nothing at all like sailing boats, but there was the sort of marine aspect to it, I suppose, in a sense. Although it's rivers, it was fun.
Do they have locks down there as well?
Oh yeah,
yeah.
I know it's the whole thing. Basically, the wine was transported throughout the country or from all the different vineyards via canals. It's one of the reasons they were built. They were basically transport networks.
This is going back how far though?
I don't know when I don't remember exactly, but at least 16th century.
Right.
I can't remember exactly those details because it's been a while, but you can travel, from anywhere in France practically. Well, not anywhere. Let's say if you're in Paris, you can travel from Paris all the way to Russia through inland waterways.
Wow.
Yeah.
That would take some time.
It would take some time,
but
you
bring
it's
some
doable.
wine with you.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's doable. That's the
wow.
the interesting thing. You can travel all over the country. You can travel from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean through the middle of the country, through the canals.
Wow. That's something to do. That's on the bucket list.
Several people have done it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of sailboats have done it as well, where they just take their mast down and can then motor their way through the waterways.
And I imagine that there'd be a lot of different ways to go as well.
Oh yeah, but that was I did that for about 3 years, and I worked freelance doing luxury cycling tours, and then I started my own business doing wine and gastronomic touring, and which is what I'm still doing. But what I've started in Paris a couple of years ago to complement, because I've always loved being in vineyards and I like wine, so I started exploring Paris's vineyards. And it was a fascinating history once I got into it, to discover just how much wine was being produced in Paris, and the fact that the wines of Paris were among the greatest wines of Europe. In the Middle Ages, it was the economic driver. It's what built the city, and it's basically what fueled the economy in the Middle Ages and contributed directly to the development of the Gothic style in architecture. So you could say Notre Dame owes its origins to wine.
Right, and was that through the taxes on wine, or was it?
No, because basically there was a lot of wealth generated from the sale of wine, because monasteries, the biggest ones were Saint-Germain-des-Prés, Notre-Dame de Paris, and Saint-Denis. And they were the principal landowners next to the king and noblemen. And so they would cultivate huge areas. They had enormous areas of vines, producing huge volumes of wine, which they made specifically for sale. Obviously, they only needed a certain amount for the Mass, because you don't need bottles and bottles for the Mass.
No.
The allotment that monks would receive on a daily basis would be between 2 and 3 liters per person, which sounds like a lot, but a third of that was probably used for cooking, and another third would be used for medicine. The wines were probably also, quite certainly, in fact, would contain less alcohol. They'd be 8, 9, 10 degrees alcohol, as opposed to today 12, 13, 14, sometimes 15. Yeah, so the use of wine, the sale of wine, it was the main economic driver. So it's what built the city, and so in fact, ironically, then as the city expanded, this fueled the expansion of the city, which then, of course, eclipsed the vineyards. So they were gradually replaced by buildings, because the equation was, what was more valuable, real estate or for housing or for...
That's fascinating.
But they were active vineyards. People were still cultivating their own vineyards in Belleville right up into the 1950s.
Yikes.
And where Jussieu University is, on the right bank, was the Allovan. It was the original wine storage facility for the whole of Paris. And in 1835, the consumption of Parisians was about a million hectolitres. By 1865, 30 years later, the population had tripled and the wine consumption had tripled.
Sure.
So That proved to be too small. So instead, they moved, or they built a new wine facility, which is Bercy, some of which you can still see today. But unfortunately, from my perspective, it's a rather sad place, given that the soul of wine has completely disappeared. Because the soul of wine is what? It's basically nature. You're basically tasting the fruits of nature's productivity. I mean, what you can get in your glass is sunshine, and a combination of sunshine and this fabulous living soil, which is so little the case today.
Yeah.
So much wine now is just crap because it's being produced chemically. They're technical wines. They're not like Coca-Cola. They're not living. And wine as something to it's always been celebrated for its healthful effects because it's one of the best antioxidants. It's very good for digestion. It's very good for a lot of things. And the monks used it for countless remedies. Some of which I suppose were not necessarily that efficacious. But
what about as we pushed forward? You said sort of in the mid 19th century, I think. Was it around then that they started? Didn't they start building these water fountains because everyone was drinking too much wine?
Oh no! Well, that was. You mean the Wallace fountains?
Yeah.
No, I think Wallace was an Englishman who, I think, just found it difficult to get a glass of water, so decided to bequeath all these fountains. I don't know exactly that story, but I think it's something to do with that. There was a problem with sanitation in the Middle Ages. People were unaware of diseases, bacteria, and so on, and so water was polluted. And obviously, they had the best water imaginable when it was clean. But they put everything into it. I mean, they just didn't care about... Sanitation was not understood, so living on a river, basically all kinds of waste was just dumped straight into the river. So downstream from a city, for example, would be pretty horrific. So the city itself found, water was generally polluted. And so it's true that there was a lot of mixing of wine with water, for example, or just drinking wine.
What about these places that you've recommended or that you've mentioned, the sort of hidden secret vineyards of Paris? If someone's a tourist out there and they're thinking to come to Paris, they're quite interested, of course, we'd point them towards Paris Wine Walk to do a walk with you. But let's say they've only got 20 minutes and they want to pop into a vineyard. Are these all accessible and open to the public, or do you need to know the right people?
You can't. None of them are really directly accessible. There's a new vineyard actually in the 11th, and I think the park is called Juillot. I've forgotten the address exactly in my head, but most of them are actually fenced in, and so you can't actually get into them. The reasons for that being, obviously, if they were open to the public, then people would, as soon as the grapes started coming on, everyone would be in there picking them, stealing the grapes. So they're all cloistered. They're all actually walled. You can't get into them. But you can... some of them can be visited. For example, the Clos Montmartre. I work with the Commanderie du Clos, so we have a special arrangement, and they have a key, so we can go in and actually be in among the vines and actually, be in the vineyard.
And what you can just do that? What you can do that whenever you want? Because
when I've organized a tour with a group of people, it takes I have to pay them for that, so it's a minimum of 8 people for 6 or 8 people. Also, with the other vineyards, basically, we look at them from outside of the wall.
Sure.
I mean, there's not a huge interest in necessarily being among the vines exactly, but although it would be obviously sweet to be able to do that. But in general, that's not what, it's just we look at them as a starting point to talk about the history of the city from the perspective of wine, which is, of course, it's a completely different approach. It's a unique perspective on the history of the city. Because most people, when they're visiting Paris, think of the revolution, or they think of monarchies, and they see the architecture. But to imagine the entire city covered in vineyards there were not exclusively vines. They would be interspersed with grains and trees and bushes and all kinds of things. So it wasn't monocultural the way it is today. Vineyards would be there'd be large sections of vines mixed with a field of wheat and so on, broken up that way. And if you were a peasant and you were working vines, basically you were working for a seigneur, a lord, nobleman, or for the church. And you could, after 7 years, become half owner. Or you would have half of the vineyard in usufruct. So you would have the use of it, and you could get, you could make your own wine. But no, the vineyards are basically protected from, people trampling them and
Sure.
them.
But when was this? When was Paris most covered in vineyards? If we were to look through old maps.
Yeah, the vine was. It was. First of all, when the Romans were here, there were already vines with the Parisi when the Romans came.
So we're talking 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Right back at the start.
Absolutely. And then it was the Romans started planting, and then it was more particularly, and especially the monks of the 8th century really began cultivating the vine, and right through till the 17th century.
Right. So that must be quite interesting looking at the old maps of Paris and seeing where...
Very few of them. I've looked at a lot of old maps where vineyards are not necessarily indicated, because they would have been a mixture of, it would be land that was being cultivated to all kinds of different things. And the interest, I think it was sort of in the mindset of people at the time, was that it was a given. They didn't really need to point out where the vineyards were. It was just, they were there. There are, of course, references, there are written references to various vineyards, like the Clos de La, which was, if you look at the Fontaine Saint-Michel, the Place Saint-Michel.
Yep.
Going west from there towards the Rue
Rue du Bac?
No, not as far as the Rue du Bac. It's the Rue Dauphine. That section all through there from the Saint-André des Arts to the Rue Dauphine and along the quay was one of the most important vineyards that belonged to Saint-Germain-des-Prés, for example. There was the Abbey Saint-Victor, which is where Jussieu is today. Also had a very important vineyard called Le Grenache, and I've still not been able to determine whether it was called the Grenache because it was planted to Grenache, the grape varietal, or because that was a name they just gave it. But it was considered among their best wines.
We need. I hate to interrupt you, but I see the time's running out, and I think we need to talk about the tours that you do.
With pleasure.
So it's called Paris Wine Walks. You're taking a walk on the vine side here. And I'm just reading off your brochure, but that's a great play on words. But what are you doing there? You're walking around.
Well, basically, every tour involves. It starts with a sort of historical background visiting a vineyard as a way of it's a departure point for talking about a neighborhood. There are tours in the Marais, in the Jardin des Plantes, which is Latin Quarter, Saint-Germain-des-Prés, the Clos Montmartre, and Belleville. And Belleville is one that's a little different from the others because that is a wine bar crawl, and it's more focused on wine tasting because there's 3 tastings. There are 2 tastings there's also one I do on bike, which is called the 3 Vineyard Cycling Tour. And that involves 2 tastings, and generally we end up in a wine shop or wine cellar, and where there's, in addition to tasting wines, I always provide exquisite, excellent bread, because I'm insistent about the quality of everything.
Bread, sure.
Because this is really what it's all about, is taste. I mean, what I'm really celebrating in part is a recognition of what's real, what is real wines, living wines. Everything we taste is organic or biodynamic, because a living soil is really what gives the vitality to anything growing. And if you have a soil that's been destroyed through chemical abuse, you end up with something that's completely flat and uninteresting. So the tours generally run between 2 and 3 hours, with the exception of the 3 Vineyard Cycling Tour, which is about 5 hours.
Right. And who are the typical customers that you get?
Well, I've had people from all over, but we do get a lot of North Americans and Australians and, they're Anglophones predominantly. I've had a number of French people as well. Because in addition to this, I actually organize wine tours all over Europe. Particularly in France, but most recently I was in Alsace in Germany, and I attend professional tastings all the time. So I know a lot of winemakers.
You must have a sharp palate.
My palate is reasonably good, I guess.
Yeah, mine's useless.
How do you know?
Absolutely useless. If you could fix it for me, I can't smell or taste anything.
Well, I think you probably can. We just need to practice a bit.
Yeah, I think it needs practice.
It does take a bit of getting to know language as well, because there's things that are evoked through when you're tasting, and when the conscious act of tasting It can be incredibly poetic.
I'd love you to take me on a tour one day and teach me, but I think you'd be disappointed. I feel like it'd be like if you took a blind person to the Louvre and you said, like, look at this, and then, well, I can't see it. That's how it...
I think everybody has the capacity to taste. I think everybody has the capacity to also to smell, unless you actually, there's a term for not being able to smell. I forget what that is called, but if you practice it, I think it becomes, it's like, riding a bike.
Right.
You get better at it.
Right. Well, that's handy that you got a biking and a wine tour. People can practice everything at once.
Well, I cycle everywhere anyway, so
yes.
That's one of my favorite tours.
Your bike is in the courtyard downstairs.
Indeed.
If you can ever get me in that the vineyard in Montmartre, I'd love to come to that. I'd love to walk. I don't know if you're allowed to touch the vines, but I'd love to walk like Russell Crowe in
October 5th. I think October 6th is the Fête de la Vigne,
right,
which is on a Sunday. On Saturday, I have a group of people for Montmartre.
Okay, well there you go. We'll do it.
Okay.
We'll sort that out afterwards. But Paris Wine Walks is the name of the tour company. Geoffrey Finch is the man that you're looking for. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, and thanks for coming on the Eiffel Tower.
It was a pleasure.
Well, there you have it. That was Geoffrey Finch from Paris Wine Walks. Once again, if you want to find out more about him, it's paris-wine-walks.com. All the information, as always, will be in the show notes below. And lucky for you, if you're a Patreon supporter in the Eiffel Tower Member Club, you'll already see that uploaded this very morning was a big chunky PDF with all the addresses for every secret vineyard that Geoffrey mentioned, as well as the PDFs from the last couple of episodes. But there you go, Secret Vineyards in Paris with Geoffrey. Check it out. Now, on for a bit of Gmail from some listeners to this show before we get into French today. I figured I'd start this one with, you know what, before I get into the emails here, I thought I'd just mention, if you're not in the book club, you've been missing out this week or two, because David Downey, who was a recent guest on this very show, has joined the book club and started answering everyone's questions. I've never seen it before. We've never had a current author get in the book club and get involved like that. He's in there, he's posting questions, he's answering questions. That's the book for this month. Go and check it out. Paris, David Downey. He's in there. So pretty exciting there. But onto the Gmail, as I like to call it. This first one is in from Nan Moss, and she says, OMG, and she spelt it out with G-E-E. There's a reference to my old surname there. And imagine if my middle name, by the way, began with M. Then it would be OMG. Anyway, that's a sidetrack. She says, I am so excited to see all of what you're introducing this season. I remember commenting that I didn't quite catch the restaurants that the mayor of the 18th arrondissement mentioned at the end of your excellent interview with him, and that's true. Nan messaged me and she said, I didn't quite catch that the restaurant in the middle there. She says, you promised to follow up, and lo and behold, you didn't settle for a simple answer, but introduced the super keepsake PDFs for Patreon supporters, and they are so fantastic that they will fill a book by the time of my next visit to Paris. True, they're gonna add up pretty quickly, Nan. She says, your weekly newsletters contain fun stories and special extras that open more doors to secret corners of my favorite city. Stop right there. Actually, I'm sure a lot of you have read my most recent email. If you haven't, you should sign up. But funnily enough, speaking of opening more doors, it's all about a story that happened when I opened a sort of secret door in Paris recently. Nan continues. She says, you continue to bring the most interesting guests. It made me smile to hear an extra spark of enthusiasm in your voice when hosting lovely Lena last week. Your pride in her success was evident, and rightfully so. Her shopping tips were much appreciated, and the rise of her business is so exciting. She continues, your podcast has calmed me while flying through turbulent skies on a recent flight, but usually I'm listening while much calmer and walking my neighborhood in Paso Robles in California. If you've not heard about it, it's one of the most exciting places for wine in California. Our door and our wine will be open to you, so come for a visit. Keep up the great work. Okay, Nan, I'm on my way. I'll keep that in mind. And then she adds a PS, I forgot to ask a question. She obviously knows I like when people ask questions. She says, I'd really like to know about this. Come on, can't you check out the tango dancers on the Seine River and have a go at it with Lena? She'll help you dress the part, I'm sure. Where do they dance, when, who dances, etc. Okay, well, I've put it on my list, Nanette. You've got Nan and Nanette. I'll put it on my list, Nanette. It's something I'm going to look into. Good tip there. I've never gone down there. I'm not much of a dancer, but I will do it.
It sounds like fun. On to the next email. It's from Angela Pugh, and she's responded to my weekly newsletter that I send out to everybody, and she says, "Gosh, Oliver, that was a really funny story. You do stumble on some interesting characters. What did you discover at the drag show, I wonder?" Well, that's a whole extra story that I'm not going to get into. But she says, on another thing, I know you like to hear where people listen to your podcasts, and I often listen to you as I walk my dog through the bush, or sometimes when I'm sewing quilts. I love that. She says, but when my husband and I were caravanning through drought-stricken New South Wales and Queensland in Australia, we happened across cattle being driven through the long paddock while listening to your podcast, Things You Should Never Do in Paris. We both thought the contrast was so fantastic. I hope you find this fun too. Cheers from Angela in Ballarat, Victoria. That is quite the contrast, quite the juxtaposition there. Things you shouldn't do in Paris while watching cattle in drought-stricken Eastern Australia. Thank you for letting me know that. I appreciate that. Always love to hear where you guys are from. This week, incidentally, I bumped into two listeners to this show in Paris. One was Leslie, who just stopped me randomly in the street of Montmartre, which was wonderful. Hello, Leslie, if you're listening. And she was a Patreon supporter. I think that's the first time a Patreon supporter stopped me in the street. That was a real kick. And then the other one was Emma, an Irish girl in Paris, living, I don't know where she's living, but she was in Belleville, and she said, Oliver, it seems like you're always talking to Americans in America. Don't forget there are people in Paris too. So there you go, Emma. I dedicate this episode to you. How about that? Now, on to a little bit of French Today before I go any further. And if you're new to this show, French Today is the sponsor. They do audiobooks, and if you want to learn French, you should check them out, frenchtoday.com/earful9. Now, I realize today is the last day of September, so that's only going to work today if you're listening on release day. If you're listening in October, make it Earful 10. But what I figured I'd do, a lot of the times I just sort of pick interesting words or tell stories, or I chat with Camille from French Today, but I thought I'd go a little bit on the method of how they teach, because this is kind of interesting. In one of the early books, so this is perfect if you're a beginner, she has a section that's called What is a Gliding? And if you don't know what that is, I thought I'd just give it a little sort of touch up on it, because this is something that's quite interesting. I'm going to read from her audiobook here. It says, a gliding is what happens in modern French, which is what she teaches, when we glide over some letters. Kind of like gotta go instead of I have got to go in American English. It's very common nowadays in French and reinforces the difference between spoken and written French. I'm going to continue here. She says, the use of glidings differ among people. It's a question of context, age, social class, region, and personal preference. Some people glide a lot, others enunciate more, but every French person applies some glidings, so it's essential that you get accustomed to understanding them, even if you choose not to use them. So a good example of this spoken versus written French is in the phrase, which we'd say in English, it's not nice out, there's no sun. When it's in written form, the phrase is, il ne fait pas beau, il n'y a pas de soleil. When it's spoken by a native Parisian to another, it sounds like this. Il fait pas beau, il pas de soleil. Y a pas de soleil. There you go. Y a pas de soleil. And this is not an exaggeration, nor specific to a teenager or a hipster. This is how anybody engaging in small talk will say it. I'm going to repeat it here, and I encourage, if you are checking out her audiobooks, to repeat these bits after. But instead of il ne fait pas beau, il n'y a pas de soleil, it's il fait pas beau, y a pas de soleil. It needs some getting used to, but thanks to my realistic audio novels, this won't be a problem for you. There you go. That's a whole part of the Un Mois Paris first encounter in the first audiobook. Obviously, there's a heck of a lot more, and the best way for you to figure that out is to get in there. FrenchToday.com/earful9 or earful10 if you're listening to this in the future. But that's about it for me. You've got a couple of cool episodes coming up, including one with a very Hemingway twist, one with a very Best Bar in Paris kind of twist, and one about the Parisian man. We always talk about the Parisian woman. Let's talk about the Parisian man a little bit. But don't forget, if you sign up on Patreon, patreon.com/TheEarfulTower, you get an invite to my big event, October 22nd. If not, keep listening. There's going to be more episodes every week, every Monday. And I look forward to talking to you then. Au revoir.